Welcome everybody to Wetland Wednesdays. This is our 8th and final bird ID installation. Don't worry, next week we'll be doing a whole bunch of review. But for now, this is our last group of species that we'll be covering for the MarshWatch program. So I'd just like to say that I'm joining you today from Saskatoon, which is located on Treaty 6 territory. This encompasses the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis. My name is Leanne Latchmoy, and I work for a nonprofit organization called Birds Canada. We've got a mission to drive action to increase understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. And one of my favorite ways to do this is through webinars and series like this, where I get to share my enthusiasm for all of the critters, but especially the wetland birds. And we'll see a little bit later this evening some examples of how I've gotten to work with some of these wetland species, because I've gotten to work with a couple of pretty cool ones, and one we've got tonight. Okay, so we're going to go through several birds and toads this week. That's going to be recorded as always, and then afterwards we're going to have time for quizzes and discussions, and those won't be recorded, but there's going to be lots of quizzes available online as well. Okay, so birds and frogs for today, or toads today actually. So we've got Virginia rail, yellow rail, LeConte sparrow, Nelson sparrow, western and Clark's grebes, bobolink, as well as the plains spadefoot and the Great Plains toad. So without further ado, let's go introduce the Virginia rail. The Virginia rail is a neat one. It's kind of a medium-sized rail. It's pretty skulky and secretive. We talked about the Sora rail, or Sora, a couple of weeks back, and that's one of the more bold ones in terms of the secretive one. We actually got to see one on one of our walks, but the Virginia rail is going to be a much tougher bird to see. So this is going to be one where knowing the call is really going to help you out for, knowing that it's there in the first place. But if you do get the chance to see it, it can easily be identified by its long drooping reddish bill and that pale gray face. Males and females look the same. It's got a really short tail. There's kind of a barely there tail idea, but it's usually upturned when it's walking around. Otherwise, the bird has fairly warm tones, and there's black and white barring kind of on the back half of the flanks. But really, it's going to be that drooping red bill and that pale face. That pale face really stands out, especially, when we're seeing a lot of marsh birds. Sometimes we're, just catching glimpses of them when they're, skulking through cattails or reeds. And, that light patch on the face is really going to stand out more than, a lot of the darker tones. So, they might be fairly shadowed, but those light parts stand out a fair bit. So that pale kind of grayish face and that drooping reddish bill. Definitely secretive. They're also fairly nocturnal. They will call occasionally during the day, but they really, they call a fair bit throughout the night, as well as in the really, really early morning. And I'm talking like, around sunrise, and then, half hour after sunrise, there's a decrease in their calling rates. So this is one of those ones that's a little bit more difficult to detect. The Sora, they're going to be calling kind of all day. If you happen to make a loud noise, they'll be calling. I accidentally sneezed in the field this past week, and that set a Sora off nearby going. The Virginia rail is not the same. They're definitely a lot more secretive, but you'll find them in wetlands with a lot of emergent vegetation because they are secretive and they need to skulk. So they wade around in water. They can actually swim a little bit, but most of the time they like to remain hidden. So they've got two calls that they commonly do. And the first one I'm going to play for you is called the ticket call. And they kind of just repeat this ticket, 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 ticket. I'll play that again. And that's not a call that travels a terribly long ways. Another one that they do is the grunt. And it seems like they'll often do this in pairs, like the two of them will get going, but it can just be the one bird as well. And it almost sounds like, like a pig in the marsh or something. Definitely a grunty, squeaky noise. And I do find that one's a little bit easier to hear at a distance than the ticket. The ticket really blends into a lot of other marsh noises. So for the Virginia rail, we've got that ticket and the grunt call. This is a prober and a pecker. They're going to be walking around and they'll eat a lot of snails and slugs, insects, spiders, earthworms, amphipods, amphibians, little, tadpoles or very small frogs that they can get their bills on, and also the seeds of aquatic plants, but primarily eats animal matter. And it's a pretty handsome little bird. I haven't seen a ton of them. I've actually been fortunate enough to band a few, but otherwise they're pretty difficult to lay your eyes on, and they're a lot more easier to hear if you're going out, at night at a wetland, which is, I'm not gonna lie, one of my favorite places to be at night is near a wetland. If you can handle the mosquitoes, it's quite, the soundscape is just amazing. So if you ever get the chance to, I suggest going to visit a wetland at night. It's pretty amazing what's active. Here's a distribution for the Virginia rail. It's pretty widespread across a big swath of North America. Get them, across a fair bit of Saskatchewan here in the Great Plains. But you'll get them in southern Ontario and southern Quebec as well as the Maritimes. Next up, we have the yellow rail. This is a species at risk. It's considered just at risk, special concern. That's what I'm looking for. So it's a small rail. It's a pretty compact little bird, and it's got the short yellow little bill, similar to what the Sora has, but it's a little bit smaller. Both sexes are very kind of nondescript. They're very streaked with browns and kind of warm brown tones, black, little bits of white. And these guys are extremely, extremely secretive. They're very, very difficult to see. They're highly, highly nocturnal. And they inhabit kind of these large expanses of shallow, grassy or sedgy wetlands, and, places that are just kind of, ankle deep with water, and these expanses of like kind of moist, grassy, sedgy areas. They're not places that most people want to go take a walk in, especially at night, which is when these birds are active. They do not call, generally speaking, during the day. I know some folks have heard them in the Hudson Bay lowlands calling during the day, but I think that the nighttime up there is so short that they have to take advantage of some of the daylight hours. But further south, they're highly nocturnal. In flight, if you do happen to scare one up, it's going to be, a small bird that's going to fly low into a next spot, but it's going to have a little bit of white in the wings here. And you can see this. It's amazing that somebody managed to get this shot, considering it's such a secretive bird. So this little white patch on the wings, this small skulky bird, and they're rails, so they're quite laterally compressed. They look pretty broad from the side, but head on they're quite narrow, and they're really, really good at just walking through just incredible dense grassy stuff. They kind of worm their way through. They almost, if you've ever watched a mouse travel through thick grass, they really remind me of a mouse. And I've got a video to show you in a little bit here of one just walking around a little bit. So what they eat primarily is small snails. This is a really, really important part of their diet. They'll also eat aquatic insects, terrestrial insects, and a little bit of seeds as well. But those little snails are really important. And here's just a few examples, post catching some of these birds in the kind of sedgy, grassy habitat that you might perchance get to see them in. So the best way to detect them is by sound, and they make a call that sounds like tapping two stones together, and it goes tick, 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 tick. So that kind of 2 ticks and then 3 ticks and then repeated over and over and over. So let's play that tick, tick call. And that is pretty distinct. It really doesn't sound like a bird is making that noise. It sounds like somebody's tapping some stones together. It's a pretty neat vocalization as far as birds are concerned, I think, because it's one of those things that wouldn't strike you as a bird or even an insect. You'd just be left scratching your head wondering, what on earth is going on. So that tick, 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 like tapping stones. So part of what brought me out to Saskatchewan in the first place was working on a project that involved trapping this species out near Foam Lake, Saskatchewan. And how might you trap a nocturnal, secretive bird that likes to walk around through grass? Well, you do it at night. And when I say night, I really mean night, if you start to get a little color on the horizon, which, happens fairly early here on the prairies because there's not a lot of trees to block that light on the horizon, you know, as soon as it started to get like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, you couldn't be trapping anymore. It really had to be a couple of hours in the darkest part of the night. So we'd have bright headlamps, we'd have some fish landing nets, we would be playing their calls because they're quite territorial, and a lot of patience. And so we would watch for, little bits of grass swaying ever so lightly, get them to come in close, and then put that net over them or catch them and catch them that way. Or sometimes they would fly right at you. The really aggressive ones would just, come flying at your headlamp, and they'd land nearby and walk up to you, and then you could catch them with the net. In between 2011 and 2015, we marked 108 individuals. And what was interesting about that was that we only ever had one that was caught between years. It was the very last bird that happened to be caught, which was pretty amazing in that final year. But this is a species that, needs such ephemeral conditions on the landscape that it's not going to be tied to a single place. And I had this conversation this weekend with someone who was asking, and a lot of wetland birds, because the conditions can be so variable, it's not like a passerine that's going to, some of them come to the same patch of trees year after year to breed. A lot of wetland species, the habitat that they rely on changes a fair bit, from year to year. And so there's no strong tie to a specific location because it's not advantageous. You might come back to it and find it completely dry or totally flooded. So it was interesting to see that, we only had one bird that we were able to recatch between years, even though we were in a really, great place for this species, lots and lots of habitat. So it was pretty amazing. We would band them. That involves putting a little metal band on their leg, take some weight measurements. We'd also take a couple of feather samples because we were helping out someone who was looking at radioisotopes. She was working on them in the US. And here's just a little video of releasing yellow rail after it's been bandaged, so just so you can see how it walks. And I really feel like it moves around like a little mouse. There's no sound on the video. And they have very sharp claws, and they actually, a lot of rails have a little bit of a remnant nail, a little claw on the edge of their wings, and that helps them get through vegetation if they're in really thick stuff. And off it goes, just kind of walking through the cattails. It's definitely one that walks a lot more than it flies. This is the distribution of the yellow rail, so kind of a centrally located species. There's that little tiny population out in Northern California and Southern Oregon, but by and large, it's going to be kind of from the Great Plains all the way up to the Hudson Bay lowlands, because they have really large expanses of sedge meadows up that way. So we have less of them here on the prairies, and especially those wetlands are some of the ones that are generally more at risk of being converted to cropland because, they're shallow wetlands. They're easy in the dry years to, disc and plant to annual crop. Okay, next up we have two very similar sparrows, and they're so similar, and they're so, they're sneaky little birds. They're not ones that are going to sit up and sing nicely for you. So they're so similar that I'm going to start off just comparing the two songs without any photos to give you an idea for how much you should be relying on the sounds for these two species. So the LeConte sparrow sounds a bit like an insect. It goes ticka. It's a little bit like an insect. So it sounds like an insect. Chicka-chee. The Nelson sparrow sounds sort of like throwing, bacon into a hot sizzling pan. Or sometimes I think it sounds a bit like tequila. Use whatever works in your own brain, bacon sizzle or tequila, but it's a very quiet, very ephemeral little song. And that's not one that you can usually hear from a great distance away, or if there's a lot of other birds going, it almost disappears into the wind. So we got LeConte doing that chicka ch. That sounds like a grasshopper a little bit. And then our Nelson sparrow, that bacon sizzle. So a very kind of sizzly, ephemeral little song. Well, now, what the heck do these two sparrows look like? Well, like I said, they look fairly similar, and given their secretive nature, the small details that you use to tell these two species apart are often not easily seen. I can probably count on one hand the amount of times that I've been able to identify either a LeConte or a Nelson's by sight alone, and it's probably 2 or 3 times, because most of the time they don't give you a good look, and if you do see them, they're a little bit too far away to judge these kind of finer scale markings. So what are the differences between these two similar birds? So there's that median crown stripe, so that stripe on the crown that runs right down the center. Both species, it's bordered in black, but in the LeConte, it's a pale kind of straw colored. And in the Nelson sparrow, it's this kind of gray, this kind of slaty gray color right there down the center. And the nape is also different. So that portion on the back of the neck there in the LeConte, it's got these kind of almost purplish little streaks. And in the Nelsons, it's mostly just kind of this similar slaty gray color, maybe a little bit lighter than the crown stripe, but that kind of plain gray. And if you think that's going to be tough to tell at a distance, you are absolutely correct. So this is why I'm kind of focusing on the sounds for the species. At a distance, these two sparrows are going to look fairly orangey and, kind of warm orange tones overall. They got this orange wash to the breast, fair bit of orange on the face. They both have a little gray cheek patch, and they both have some contrasting black markings on their face. So those lateral crown stripes, those one bordering that center one, as well as that bit of an eye stripe. But like I said, fairly secretive and fairly similar looking. This is one that is way easier to identify based on the call. Here's just another couple looks at them. You can see a little bit better those crown stripes, but again, it's harder to see those that nape in the back. So the LeConte sparrow, you're going to find it in open habitat that's kind of, marshy meadows, slightly drier places, but moist soil. So not, dry upland areas. Still going to be fairly kind of wet. So on the edges of larger wetlands, especially if that wetland is embedded in, a grass ecosystem or a parkland ecosystem, it's not something that's cattails and then straight to crop. So, drier habitats, moist soils, kind of, getting in the proximity of wetland areas. They'll eat seeds and insects as well as arthropods. The Nelson's likes it a little bit wetter. So it's got shallow, kind of grassy, sedgy wetlands. Or quite thick grassy meadows. I actually heard one this past week, and it was in a small little kind of, it wasn't, you couldn't barely call it a creek, but a little wet area, probably lightly spring fed. You couldn't really see any open water, but you could definitely tell that the grass down in there was really, really thick, really, really lush. You could tell there was a bit of sedges mixed into the grass, and sure enough, there was a Nelson sparrow calling from it. Like the LeConte, it's going to be eating seeds and insects and arthropods. So comparing those two songs again, we've got the the insect-like for the LeConte sparrow. And the Nelsons, that kind of more bacon, ephemeral, throwing bacon into a hot pan, or that tequila. For whatever reason, that works for me. Most people can't hear it. Okay, let's take a look at those ranges. The core of it is going to be in kind of central Western Canada, so the prairie provinces, and you'll find them all up through the boreal forest in some of those, meadowy areas along the edges of rivers and such. A little bit in the Hudson Bay lowlands, and scattered populations in different places. Nelson sparrows kind of similar, a little bit more limited in distribution, kind of in the central part of its range, but you'll find them more along the Hudson Bay coast, and you'll also find them on the coast of, say the Maritime provinces and Quebec in Canada. You might see, if you have an older field guide, this might be called Nelson's sharp-tailed sparrow, or it might just be called sharp-tailed sparrow. It's gone through a bit of name changes over the years, but the current name is Nelson's sparrow. Okay, changing gears from little brown things, we've got some black and white things. So first up, we have the Western grebe. This is a pretty large, showy grebe. This is going to have a long, graceful neck with quite a long, pointed bill. The sexes are going to look similar, and they're very black and white, kind of, mostly black above with a kind of nice white that comes up the neck. They've got a white belly and, goes around kind of that cheek area. They have a dull yellowish bill. It's got a little bit of dark on it, but it's not a super bright yellow bill. And the black extends down below the eye. And this is going to be important when we're comparing to Clark's, but that dark kind of area around the eye is going to be indicative of a Western grebe. So you can imagine that dark crown patch just kind of coming down and totally encircling the eye area. But this is a very, elegant looking grebe. You're going to find it in large bodies of water, so large wetlands or lakes. It's a fish specialist, so they need to have, a fair bit of fish. They nest in large stands of emergent vegetation, and they're a colony nester, which means that they will, basically nest with friends around. So you'll often find many grebes nesting in close proximity in these colonies. And they have an interesting call. It kind of sounds like a creaky gate opening and closing, and it's definitely two-parted. They'll do a creak. And because they're often found on large bodies of water, that travels a fair ways. Sound really has a way of traveling over water, and you'll get that creak going quite a distance. So as I mentioned, they're a fish specialist. They're a diving species, as we've discussed earlier. All of the grebes have their legs really far back on their bodies, which makes them, very terrible at getting around on land. They practically can't walk. They can manage to get up onto their nests, and kind of that's about it. They'll occasionally catch other prey, but really they're quite the fish specialist. And Western grebes are also really well known for doing a lot of elaborate courtship displays, as we've seen in the other grebes. Here's an example of the weed ceremony of the Western grebes, where both individuals of a pair are just going to go underwater, grab a bunch of vegetation, and dance around each other with plant matter in their bills, to reinforce that pair bond, or in the early stages of pair bonding, to see if they're suitable, if they like each other's dancing skills. And in the bottom left-hand corner here, we can see an adult feeding a body feather to a chick, or he's less a chick at that point, more of a fledged young. And a lot of grebe species will eat a fair number of feathers, and this is thought to help them digest fish bones a little bit better. So it plugs up that stomach, so it slows down how fast stuff can move through. And the thought is that helps them to digest fish bones a little bit better. So the adults will often pluck their own body feathers and feed them to their kids, which you can see in the bottom photo here, which I think is pretty cute. The Western grebe I feel like, is pretty aptly named. It's got a very Western distribution in Canada, a little bit in kind of the center, but definitely not an Eastern species. So come on out and check out the Western grebes if you ever get the chance. One that you might see mixed in with the western grebe is called the Clark's grebe. This is a species that is far less abundant than the western grebe, but you will find them mixed in with western grebe colonies. And so if you just take a good look at all of the western grebes, if you're ever taking a look at them, you might find a few Clark's grebes in there. So it's going to be very similarly sized and shape and look. But the thing that's going to separate the two is that white area around the eye. So in the western grebe, the black kind of went down and kind of encompassed, the feathers around the eye. In the Clark's grebe, think of it this way: you can see, like the letter C, the eye. You can see it a little bit better. It is, surrounded in white feathering. That bill is also a fair bit brighter. Remember in the western grebe, it was kind of this like, a dull yellow. It had a fair bit of black on it. In the Clark's grebe, this is a bright yellow bill, and it really does stand out, even at a distance. So in this bottom photo here, this is taken a fair ways away. Maybe the lighting isn't great, but you can see the eye in the Clark's grebe because there's all that white around it. You can't in the western, and that brighter yellow bill actually does stand out compared to the darker westerns. So it's going to have, similar habits, similar locations, large wetlands, lakes, and it's also going to nest in stands of emergent vegetation. It does sound different, but still fairly similar. It's just going to do a single creek. It's not going to have that two-parted creek. It was just a simpler creek, and there were some western grebes going in the background because, like I said, they're often found in association, so hard to get a good recording of a Clark's all on its own because oftentimes the westerns are also calling. So just check it out. If you ever see a bunch of western grebes, just have a look at them and make sure that you don't have a Clark sneaking around in there because it definitely can happen. They have a similar distribution to the western grebe, so you can find them in mostly the same kind of locations. And last but certainly not least is the bobolink. This is a medium-sized blackbird. It's another species of special concern. It's got a long conical bill, which is black in males. The species show a fair bit of sexual dimorphism. So the males are going to be this kind of black and white showy blackbird. So it's going to have white on the back and the rump. So, in between the wings here, that kind of whitish area, they'll have a white wing patch. But most notable and most easily seen is this straw-colored patch on the back of the head. That's a really, really good giveaway because, some of those white patches, depending on the way the bird's holding the wing, depending on how its feathers are being held, some of those white patches are just going to be a little bit smaller. If the bird is facing you, you can usually still make out that yellowish straw patch because the bird will often turn its head. Whereas, if it's facing you, it might not turn its whole body to let you get a look at that black and white, on the back primarily. So that straw colored patch on the back of the head is your dead giveaway for your bobolink. This is a species of moist grassy fields, irrigated hay fields, and kind of the natural grassy wetland edges. You're not usually going to find it in the grassy or in the wetlands proper, thinking like of the cattails and the rushes and things like that, unless it's severely draw down and there's almost no water left in it and it's kind of on its way to, getting back to a shallower wetland system if it's a drought. But definitely moist grassy fields. They love irrigated hay fields. They really like that kind of lush, grassy type vegetation. And what's cool about this species is it also makes really interesting noises. It sounds like R2-D2 from Star Wars, and it also, just basically sounds like a little robot in the wetland. So instead of trying to imitate it because I can't, I'll just play that for you. It's pretty incredible. you know, if you get a good listen at that out in the field, there's no mistaking it. There isn't anything else that's going to sound like R2D2, like a robot out in the wetland. It's just, it's really got this incredible song, and it will often do flight displays as it's singing. So, you know, you often get a good earful of it, and you'll often see these birds and they'll chase the females around. And, you know, sometimes a few of them will get together like the males and they'll chase each other around. They're quite a showy bird. They're definitely not one of these secretive, skulky birds. The females tend to be, but the males, they're definitely a showy bird. So again, that straw patch on the back of the head is going to be your dead giveaway for the bobolink. Females, on the other hand, they're a lot more problematic to identify because they're kind of brown and streaky overall. So they're still same size, medium-sized blackbird. They have a long cone-shaped bill, which is typical of the blackbirds, but it's pinkish in the females, got a little bit of dark on it. And, you know, overall kind of this pale straw colored. They're going to have a dark cap with a pale central stripe. They'll have a dark eyeline, and the rest of the body will just kind of be variably streaked. You know, the flight feathers and the back, they're dark and they're edged in all of this straw color. The dead giveaway is that they're going to be in areas that the males are going to be in by and large. They have a yellowish wash to the belly. If you ever get a look at them, you know, sitting on a wire or something, you'll notice that bobolinks have, for whatever reason, incredibly long toenails. You can see in the bottom left here that, you know, they just got really, really long toenails for reasons that I don't really know. So that is our female bobolink. They're typically a bit more skulky. They're not going to be as showy and flashy and flying around as much as the males are. But keep an eye out. If you've got males, that's going to be your clue that they're there. Just keep an eye out for the female bobolink. So again, that overall straw color, it's going to be a similar sized bird and that kind of long cone-shaped bill. It's still going to be in those grassy areas. They might perch up on the odd shrub, but overall, you know, they're hanging out in grassy, thick vegetation. They're a gleaner, so they're going to be picking off little insects from vegetation. They'll also eat weed seeds while they're up there in the vegetation. They'll eat insects and larvae, spiders, and snails. And I had this conversation a couple of times over the weekend, and, you know, pretty much every species is going to be eating insects in the breeding season. That's what they feed their kids. That's what it's, you know, it's a really, really important food source for all kinds of birds. You know, we think a lot of sparrows, you know, they have those seed-eating bills, but in the breeding season, almost everything relies on insects because it's a really good, easily digestible protein hit. So when they're feeding their young, when they've got kids going, you know, I'm sure you've seen it, you've got birds going all around and they've got mostly insect matter in their bills, you know, whether it's little flies, whether it's grasshoppers, whether it's caterpillars of various sorts. Insects are just critically important for that nesting period, that brood rearing season, you know, and even ducks will eat little, you know, midges and hatches of things. So always remember that, you know, sometimes you curse the amount of bugs and things that are flying around, but the birds rely incredibly heavily on that. And that's, you know, part of the reason why they're back here. They come up here because there's that pulse of insect life in the summertime that's what they're relying on. That's what they're feeding their kids. So do have a lot of insects, but they're critically important. Bobolinks have quite the distribution. They'll be nesting across kind of, you know, the northern US and southern Canada, and they'll be wintering down in South America. So they have quite a long journey to make. Zooming in a little bit more on the breeding areas here. So, you know, you'll see them a fair bit in the northern US as well as southern Canada. And that's it for our birds. But we do have 2 more toads, and both of these toads are actually fossorial, meaning that they'll spend a lot of time underground. So first up, we've got the Plains Spadefoot toad. It's a relatively small toad, 1.5 to 2.5 inches, or, you know, almost 4 centimeters to about 6.5 centimeters, and they have these incredibly large eyes. I was actually surprised, you know, putting this together. I didn't realize quite, you know, how large their eyes were. I think it's pretty striking on this species. The body color, of course, is pretty variable. It can be, anywhere between tan and brown. They usually have orange spots, but not always. You can see the one in the bottom here. It might just be because it's covered in a lot of sand, so that can obscure it a fair bit. Some actually have stripes down their body, but not all of them do. And they have quite short, stubby little legs. This isn't a toad that is going to be, hopping around with any great agility or really clambering about. They're quite chubby, kind of, fat looking little toads with short legs. So the adults are primarily fossorial, meaning they spend a lot of time underground. So they'll nest in kind of, arid areas, grasslands, and they'll get into areas where they can actually dig through the ground. They've got these little areas on their hind legs that they can use to kick and bury with. So they'll spend a lot of time underground and they'll emerge in warm, wet periods. Otherwise, they're pretty nocturnal and secretive even when they are out and about. This isn't a species that I have encountered yet, but I definitely hope to one day. And they make kind of an interesting whirring noise. So I think that's a pretty distinct, you can imagine you're out in some grassy plains area and you're hearing this kind of whir, whir, whir. So that's the plains spadefoot. We also have the Great Plains toad. This is a larger species, medium to large, so 2 to 4.5 inches, or about 5 to 11.5 centimeters. And of course, remember, this is they're more adult size. Of course, they start off as a little bit smaller individuals and grow into that. The body color, of course, is quite variable: gray, browns, and greens. But they have these darker blotches, and they're quite large. They're not like some of the smaller spots of the other toads. They also have short legs, kind of chubby looking, short-legged. Again, not something that's going to really be getting around with any great efficiency. They're not going to be hopping very much. They're also fossorial when they're inactive, so they'll also spend a fair bit of time, under the soil surface, just hanging out, being a toad that doesn't do much. Sounds like a pretty nice vacation. So this is a species that you'll find in deserts, grasslands, semi-desert shrublands, open floodplains, agricultural areas. Pretty neat species. We don't have a lot of records of them in Saskatchewan, but hopefully, through a program like this, we'll spread the word about toads, and maybe you can report some new sightings of them. So they have a loud, kind of long mechanical trill. That's like, it's a little bit like wavy in sound. And that really, that call goes on for quite a long time. It almost sounds like, when kids do that. I don't know if that has a name, but it sounds a fair bit like that to me, anyhow. So that is our Great Plains toad. Let's recap our birds today. We had the Virginia rail, which is going to have that drooping red bill and that pale grayish face on that kind of rusty colored body. And it does a ticket, ticket, ticket call, as well as a grunt. As well as this lovely grunting sound. Kind of sounds like a pig. And the yellow rail, the very, very secretive, very, very nocturnal little bird that has that kind of, two stones tapping together, tick, 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 tick. Both of these species, quite secretive, fairly nocturnal. The yellow rail, very nocturnal. The Virginia rail, get into a little bit more of that kind of sunrise period, but overall, the best time to hear these two species is in the nighttime. or the Virginia rail, very, very early morning, talking sunrise, which is quite early up here. We have those two secretive kind of moist soil sparrows, the LeContes and the Nelsons. And the LeContes has that chicka kind of sounds like an insect. And we have the Nelson sparrow, that, tossing bacon into a hot pan kind of sound. And both of these species in kind of, moist soil, grassy areas. So especially, the margins of wetlands, or, just those shallow, moist soil wetlands on their own. We have our two grebe species, Western grebe with the creak creak, and the Clark's grebe with the single creak. But the best way to tell those two species apart is the amount of black surrounding the eye, or white surrounding the eye. So in the Clark's grebe, you can see the eye. It's not surrounded by anything dark. And in the Western grebe, it is surrounded by dark feathering. And we have our last blackbird, the Bobolink, that male with the lovely straw patch on the back of the head, and those kind of incredible R2-D2 robot noises. They make me laugh every time I hear them. And our two toads, that plain Spadefoot with those kind of whirring noises. And the Great Plains toad, that long trill. And got a wavering tone to it. Really goes on for quite a long time. And that's it for our species coverage. You can reach out to me at skatlas or at llatromoy@birdscanada.org. You can find the MarshWatch webpage on our Birds Canada homepage. You can reach out to Birds Canada on all the socials. And I'd just like to say a big thank you to our supporters, the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, the Government of Canada, the Ministry of the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, as well as SaskPower for sponsoring this program and making this sort of thing possible. So thank you all so much for listening.